everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, How We Learn to Stop Worrying and Love Social Media Governance. I am Adria Barich, an associate for Consultants Collective, as well as the editor for Biznology. I will also be moderating the Q&A. Today's webinar is being presented by GEM and our consulting division, Consultants Collective. Following the webinar, a recording will be posted on biznology.com, and I will be sending you all an email after the event with a brief survey and a link to the recording so that you can share it with your colleagues. I am joined by our featured speakers, Kpis Hall, Consultants Collective member consultant and president of Lumberjack Social, Noah Cole, global communications leader, Siemens Digital Industries Software, and Sue Cerna, CEO of Cerna Social. Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Adria, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for our informal conversation. I'm Jen Mcclure, founder and CEO of GEM, and I am really excited about this panel today because it is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So just to give a little bit more background on our speakers, and thank you all for joining us. Sue is founder and CEO of Cerna Social, which is a social media agency focusing on social media strategy, governance, and infrastructure for large enterprises. And prior to founding Cerna Social, she was the global head of social media for Cargill, which is one of the largest private companies in the US, which I did not realize. It has a very big presence here in my town of Newark, California. And she oversaw the global team and hundreds of social media channels ranging from being in the US to China. Noah Cole is a global communications leader at Siemens Digital Industries Software, where he leads not only social media, but a worldwide team responsible for PR, analyst relations, social media, advertising, so both paid as well as owned and earned. And previously, Noah was director of social media and communications at Autodesk. And then our member consultant, Kpis Hall, who, as Adria said, is also the founder and president of Lumberjack Social. And prior to founding Lumberjack Social or joining us, Kpis was with me at Thomson Reuters, where he was director of social media there. And we worked very closely together, not only on social media governance, but all digital governance across our global organization, which was a $12 billion organization with 55,000 employees. So we also saw hundreds, if not, I think more than 1,000 channels at one point, all across the globe and 110 countries in which we operated. So we have been there in your shoes, and I am really excited, and also we feel fortunate to have our panel and our member consultant, Kpis, who will be leading the discussion primarily. But I'll kick things off for everyone and just ask you each to weigh in on, let's define and put some context around what social media governance is. Unfortunately, I think it's a fairly newly emerging term, although it should have been emerging about 10 years ago. And what it means in your organizations and in your work. And then also the priority that it holds, because, you know, especially in the case of Noah, it's not your full-time job. So, you know, how do you manage social media governance in the midst of all the other priorities? So what is it? What's the scope of it? And how do you do it?
You know, I think, let's start off. One of the questions that comes up fairly often is like, well, what about YouTube or what about podcasts? So I think, you know, Sue and Noah, what do you think? I mean, in terms of like, where do you draw the line? Is it like Wikipedia? You know, do you just keep going? Like when Jen and I were working at Thomson Reuters, we, you know, started with social, and then everything else also needed, you know, a lot of governance and alignment. So it became a much more bigger digital thing that was kind of separate. But, you know, what's in and what's out, do you guys think?
I'll start. I mean, ultimately, you know, you have to look at the big picture of governance. There's governance for the web, there's governance for email. And so social governance to me is really just setting the ground rules for, you know, really how do you enable and what are the rules for operating on behalf of your company or organization, you know, in the social ecosystem. So in our world, social is definitely includes YouTube, but it doesn't include our website. Social includes Google Places, but it doesn't include email marketing. And so I think ultimately each organization sort of needs to decide where do you draw those boundaries. And I think for me, the thing that is consistent in social media governance is that social platforms are the ones that are two-way communication channels where we are being social and we can approach them with a sort of consistent set of guidelines and regulations that govern, how do we operate, how do we communicate, and then what are the ground rules for engaging with people on those platforms.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all of that. I think for us, social governance to me really equates to one thing, which is eliminating risk, right? There's about 18 kinds of risk that come with social media, and you really have to have proper guidelines and proper structure, proper framework for people so they understand what's okay and what's not okay and what the rules of the road are. In terms of where the lines are, it's very blurry, right? First of all, you have new platforms that emerge every other day. And then secondly, you have all of these platforms that I call social adjacent. So your Glassdoors, your Yelp, your, fill in the blank, right? There's a lot of social adjacent platforms that I think social media teams are rapidly getting sucked into because no one else at the company is the likely candidate to own them. So people think that you own them. And so I don't necessarily think that you have to own them, but I think that's a real conversation that has to happen. And there has to be a decision made about who really owns that. Is it HR? Is it the social team? What does that mean for resources? And unfortunately, it's something that changes multiple times a year.
Yeah. So, Sue, you were talking about risk and the 18 different kinds of risk. Why do we need to prioritize this? I mean, so what? So I have 5 Twitter channels in, South America that I'm not using. Nobody's looking at them. What's the trouble?
I feel like you're just poking the bear now. For me, I think, and I will readily admit, I know there were people at Cargill that thought I was too focused on governance, but for me, it really comes down to, protecting your social media, making sure your social media footprint is the best it can be and is most importantly under control, protects you from brand risk, right? What if somebody finds one of those Twitter handles and messages them and does not receive a response? That hurts your brand with your customer, right? So there's brand risk, there's reputation risk, there's just safety risk, right? Who knows who's running those channels if you're not running them? Who knows if they're going to go out and post something that seems to come from the company that clearly should not be coming from the company, right? And then there's things like legal risk, compliance. There's lots of regulations related to social media. My general perspective on this is if you don't have control of it, you are opening yourself to a world of hurt if you get sued or a regulator gets in there and starts questioning you.
Yeah, and I think what I would sort of add on, I also look at it as a risk mitigation approach. But to your point about control, I also look at it as it's impossible to control everything, and so in this modern day of communications, gone is the day when the PR person could be the gatekeeper to all information, and so we need to sort of approach social knowing how it can be used and how it can be misused. But also from the customer experience, they're not always sure who is it they're interacting with and where are they interacting. If they've gone and Googled your company name and ended up on a Facebook account that's not controlled, there's a risk of them consuming information or engaging with the company in a way that's not ideal. And so recognizing we can't control all of those things, to me, governance gives us the ability to sort of set some guardrails and to try and control or at least have visibility into as much as we can, while fully accepting that there's certain things we're never going to have visibility into. So if we can have some control over some things, that's better than just letting go completely.
Good life lessons as well. So, you were talking about guardrails, and, one of the things that I've tried to think about as, we're working through these kinds of governance policies is how not to just be like the enforcer and the bad cop or whatever you want to call it all the time, who's shutting down channels. Like, how do you, partner better with those teams that might see the social media governance process in that way? How can we show that this is a valuable thing and an important thing in general in terms of like corporate risk and things, but for an individual marketing manager or VP, it's like, hey, I just want to do a product launch and have a Facebook page for this event, right? Like, how can we, better partner to make it seem like we're valuable, and those guardrails or giving them the safe space in between more than just like a roadblock?
Saying no. I mean, I think that's a really good question, because I think, at the end of the day, none of us want to be that person that's always saying no to all those people that want to do things. And so for me, part of it is about education and really trying to educate people, why do we have this governance in place? Why are these the rules? And educating them about what's possible. Because I think a lot of times people hear, no, you can't create a Facebook page, when instead what they should hear is, we're really effective at using Facebook through our existing channels. So let's talk about what we can do to help you at the end of the day. And I think that the other thing that people need to sort of be empowered, whether that's to use the existing channels or to use their own channels, right? We've seen employee advocacy become an increasingly effective way for us to get information out. If not often more effective than sending it through our brand channels. And so, a lot of times people come to us, hey, we want to launch this thing. Can you please post this invitation to a webinar? And our response is not just, well, no, we don't do that. It's, you're going to be a lot more effective if you put this into our employee advocacy platform where, maybe 50 employees will share it, but it's going to get much more reach and much more engagement than if we put it out on our own brand channels. And here are all the reasons.
Noah's frozen for a second there.
And so while he's frozen, I loved what he said about you don't always want to be, social media police or the one saying no. But I think, Casey, what you and I learned first through our social media task force, and then as we evolved into our digital center of excellence, is we had an application process, we had an investment. Go ahead, Noah.
You're back.
You froze for a second.
Oh, sorry. That product manager, they may find a way to get that out there. And so I think governance is, again, it's all about setting those guardrails so that they have a place to go, but also so that there are rules if they don't come to you, that they are still sort of prevented from just going rogue.
Yeah. I mean, there are times when no is the right answer, but that's where the guidelines come in, right? We had a rule that specific individual Cargill locations could not have their own Facebook page, right? Like just straight up no. But in cases where, like what Noah was talking about, in cases where, the person has a legitimate idea or request, the answer is not no, it's that's not the right tactic, but let's talk about how to get you from A to B, right? Let's talk about how we can enable you to do the thing you want, maybe on an existing channel. I used to do a training session that we called Social Media 101, and it was a great chance to review our social media policy and those guidelines. And then we had a whole section of that training that was, here are ways you can participate in Cargill social media without having your own channel or without starting something new. And that was really helpful for folks just to understand, like, yes, I can participate in social with more support, honestly, from the global social team than going it by myself with my own channel.
Yeah. Sue and Noah, I think that you, Noah currently, and Sue, when you were in-house before, I think you both had a fairly strong central structure that you could really say no with quite a bit of authority from. I don't know that everyone is always in that position, particularly social media people, if they're not connected to, the other kind of governance things. So how do you enforce this? I mean, I think the first time that I ever tried to push back on a partner who wanted a Facebook channel for something that didn't make sense, it ended up with 5 VPs arguing on call, which was kind of a waste of everyone's time. And it was early on, we were still figuring it out. But for those who are, maybe don't have that actual authority to really tell people no, how do you make this work? Any suggestions? Influencing without authority. Yeah.
Where I go to first is I look at best practices. I look at what other brands have done. And so when people request multiple Facebook pages, I say, well, does Google have multiple Facebook pages? Do they have a page for every single product they do? Look at other companies you admire, Nike, Apple, brands that people hold up as standards. That's really the first thing I do is direct people to go look at what other brands are doing. And that's usually an effective way to get them to sort of learn. But then there's now, luckily, unlike 10 years ago when this was all starting, there's a ton of research out there. There's lots of people writing best practices. And so, if you want an example of why, what an effective Facebook strategy looks like, you can go to consultants like Sue or find other people who've written articles about this and show those to your stakeholders and say, there's a reason this is a best practice. And, use that as to guide people when you don't have the authority yourself.
Yeah, I think my answer is slightly different. It's work on trying to get the authority. I built very strong alliances. I spent a lot of time relationship building with our legal department and our compliance department and our cyber intel people. We would go have meetings regularly with those teams. And the net result was, when we got in one of those situations where 5 VPs were fighting over whether someone could have a Facebook page, I would bring in my heavy hitters and go, not only do I say no, but legal says no for this reason, compliance says no for this reason, and cyber intel says that's a terrible idea. So go ahead and fight all of us. And eventually it worked its way into official company policies. And, eventually we got the authority by building kind of a coalition of the people who should have a say in that conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead, Jen.
Well, so it takes a long time for those on the phone who are frustrated. And Casey said he was at that time in our legal business unit, which was one of 5 business units, and really trying to lead the charge, at least in that business unit. And it wasn't until we kind of we started with a community of practice. So it was very, very light governance. To the questioner, I think this aligns with this question, as where should social media governance sit, right? And that was a big question. So Casey was sitting in our legal business unit, but was in a communications role. Initially, was an attorney. That's a whole nother story. We had reference attorneys that were using Facebook really quite nicely in a social customer care and enablement with our customers around how to use Westlaw. So working with law students who were at that time on Facebook. So things, we had early social customer care and employees using social in kind of a not branded way. So he was leading the charge there. And it wasn't until I was put in place at the corporate level and we were trying to really create a corporate brand. But even then, my purview was only social. It was kind of seen as this offshoot thing. It took me 3 years to get the authority as a global vice president and the CEO saying, we will have a digital center of excellence. Digital governance, strategy enablement is important to the future of our company. And even then, we still had situations where there would be, somebody trying to come in and, an EVP level and saying, no, just give them their Facebook page. And so we got to be good friends with global procurement. And we just said, okay, all of you are like setting up stuff on LinkedIn and using your Amex cards. And we made a business case for, there's literally hundreds of thousands of dollars going on Amex cards for social media stuff, all kinds of stuff, and turn off Amex, right? So there are heavy-handed and light-handed ways. I love starting with a community of practice. Let's co-create, let's educate, let's, create the big tent. But at the end of the day, I mean, to really get your arms around it, you do have to have senior support and authority, and at a big company, generally from the C-suite. So to the question of where does it sit, I'd love to hear actually from all of you. For us, it sat in communications. That's where I initially was. But the more expansive that digital strategy enablement governance got, and the more successful we got, everybody wanted a piece of it. So there was a lot of reorgs, discussions of reorgs. Where does digital sit in the organization? But just in terms of social media governance, where does it sit? Where should it sit?
I mean, I guess my view on that is that social media governance should sit in the social media team. And, you can ask sort of where should social media sit? And, in many organizations have it in communications, some have it in marketing, some have it in support. To me, that social media governance goes hand in hand with managing social media is what's important. And I think it's important for a couple of reasons. I think the primary thing is that governance goes hand in hand with compliance. And so if you can set the rules, if you can do the act of governance, you're going to ultimately that's the biggest stick that you can wield in driving better results. Because I think, we all understand how a rogue Facebook account or, somebody out there posting things they're not supposed to can have a negative impact. Bringing those things under control really help. And I think, where I've seen in my role, governance is a two-sided, sword. On one hand, it's really powerful and really effective, but you sort of have to make sure that doesn't become your whole job. And so it's just one of the things that you're doing as part of managing social media. I think the other thing I'll add is that tools become really important in governance. And so, in both my previous role at Autodesk and now my current role at Siemens, we have examples of social media accounts or activity that's been happening historically for a really long time, and we haven't been able to get it into governance. But by introducing Sprinkler and mandating that all accounts have to go through Sprinkler, that becomes a really effective way to either get those accounts, either you're joining and you're part of the program or you're out. And so I think the other thing is you got to look at governance as a long-term roadmap. You might not be able to get everything under control right away, but by bringing in tools, bringing in new processes, then you can eventually sort of get control of that. And so I think for me, a truly effective social media management team or role, if it doesn't have governance, it's going to really lack a lot of that bite that you need to truly drive change and make it impactful.
Yeah, I want to come in on that tools point too. I think that ends up being a really, really functionally important part of what you do is getting everybody on Sprinkler or Sprout or whatever it might be. And then enforcing that. I know we had used Proofpoint and identified all of our channels out in the world and kind of searched for new ones. And then anything that was published on any of those channels that wasn't published through Sprinkler or whatever was automatically flagged and got notifications about that. So that was like one of the, I think really effective ways once we got all those tools in place to make it enforceable and to make the scale of it more, manageable.
Yeah, there's a lot of tools out there. I'll give a shout out to Chip Alberson because I see him on our call, and he's the CEO of Brandle, and that Brandle's one of our partners. Brandle's a great entry point for if you're just getting your arms around social media governance, just to find what your universe looks like. And it's not just social; it finds everything on the open web. When we started, when Casey and I were just beginning to get our arms around this, there were no, Brandles, there were no Nextgates, there were no any of that. We were doing it by hand. But what we discovered once we could use these tools is that we were probably capturing around 60% of what was actually out there. And so that foundational tool of being able to just discover and get your arms around what the ecosystem actually looks like it's great for your business case too, right? To be able to show whatever level you need to make your business case with. Here's what it actually looks like.
Yep. If I could add just two things real quick, one is, huge shout out to Brandle, my personal favorite governance tool that's out there right now. Second, I agree with Noah completely. Social governance belongs with social, regardless of where social sits in your organization. And the reason for that is really that people who don't do social media for a living have zero idea what it takes to actually run social media at this scale with this many people. You're talking about several hundred accounts or maybe even thousands. You're talking about at least 2 times that number in terms of people you're managing, and that's before you add in agencies and their teams. It is a massive undertaking to just have it under control, and people who do not work in social, like IT or compliance, do not have any idea what it's like on a day-to-day basis. And so this is where I get on my soapbox, right? It's like, you can't allow someone else to swoop in and say, we're in charge of social media governance, because they're going to make up rules that don't make any sense. It has to sit with the social team because they're the ones closest to the work.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Sue on the soapbox.
We're getting lots of questions now, so I'm going to start infusing them. And we'll start with one from Melinda Woods. Can you talk about some other tools, and totally acknowledging that one size did not fit all. It has to do with the size of your company, the type of company, the how you're structured, and how many different teams you have managing social, which sometimes there is no centralized social place. So what are some of the best publishing and listening tools that you might want to think about?
I'll I mean, yeah, anyone can start. I mean, I said Sprinkler earlier because we've gone all in on Sprinkler at Autodesk, but now several years later at Siemens. And while it may not be the best at all of the things that it does, having everything in one platform is what's truly enabling us to, I think, be successful, because we can drive governance over organic accounts, governance over paid and how people are spending money, governance over content, now increasingly not just for social, but to other channels as well. And so I think having, to start with a robust social media management platform is the first place that I would start.
Yep, I agree. So SMMS, Social Media Management System, Sprinkler, Sprout, Khoros, which used to be Spreadfast, are the kind of the big players in the space. There are others. I would also say if you're serious, you need a Brandle or a tool like that, though I don't know of any other tools like that. I would also say you need a password management tool like a LastPass or a Keeper Security.
Yep. And there's a question, what do you do when the horse has left the barn? But I think that was a situation we all walked into, right? And still walk into, because there isn't an overarching C-suite or board level understanding of the importance of social and the importance of governing social. So the horse left the barn for all of us, right? So,
the horse was never in the barn.
The horse was never in the barn. I personally would say you start with getting that audit, and good tools exist now. So where would you say, what are the 3 steps to starting social media governance when you're overwhelmed because you realize you're walking into a mess?
Yeah, I would say audit. You don't know what's out there till you know, right? When we did this exercise at Cargill, we thought we had 150 accounts and we had more like 300, and we had no idea who owned the other 150. That's where we started. The horse was like on the other side of the planet. Okay. And getting, step 2 is get it under control. And that includes both paid and organic. And it includes not only knowing how many accounts there are, but who's responsible for each one, including your ad accounts. It's a massive undertaking. It took me 2 years. And then after that, you have to put in the procedures and processes for your organization so that it doesn't become what I call the Wild West again.
I would add to that, focus on what you can change, but take a longer view, right? So look at where do you want to be in a year and write guidelines with that in mind. Don't focus initially on trying to control what people are already doing. Because if the first thing you do is do an audit and go tell everyone that's running an account you're doing it wrong, you're not going to get very far. And so instead, you sort of want to know what's out there, and then you sort of want to grandfather them in a little bit as you get everything taken care of, and you get buy-off at a senior level on what the rules should be and how you're going to do governance, and then bring those people along. But if you start with, hey, everyone, we're changing it effective today, and you can't do what you're doing, you're going to have pushback all the way along.
Yeah. I think creating that kind of safe and good path of like, this is the actual right way to do it, and developing those KPIs and having that clear way before you ever tell anyone that they're doing it wrong is really important, because otherwise you have people come back and say, well, what are we supposed to do? What does success look like? We're happy with this. So what are we measuring against? So you need to have sort of all those benchmarks figured out and a process in place for, okay, this is how you do it. First, you have to partner with an existing account. Then you have to give us your KPIs and your business case, whatever that policy looks like. Yeah. What about acquisitions? So when you have, obviously big companies, this happens fairly regularly. You acquire, some company, they have 45 different, Twitter accounts for every product that they do and every author. How have you guys handled acquisitions, best practices, horror stories?
Yeah.
That's one that comes up, I think, fairly regularly for all of us that work in this space.
Yeah, we did a ton of acquisitions and a couple divestitures, but mostly acquisitions. My worst horror story was the day that legal gave permission to brief only one member of the social media team, and that was me. And so I got the privilege of telling my boss, clear your calendar on this day, but I cannot tell you why. And then like walking into her office at 8 a.m. with a packet of stuff and being like, surprise, not great. So I at one point had a whole punch list, but my basic advice on mergers and acquisitions is if your company has an official process for handling mergers and acquisitions that kind of encompasses all the departments that have to be involved. Find a way to get social media represented in that official process so that you're not cut out of the loop and you're not caught by surprise, you know, on a deal that's been in the works for 18 months and you find out 2 days before it's announced, right? Like, try to find your way into the official checklist process so that social is just part of the communications package that has to be checked off.
Yeah. And again, that takes some time. It definitely took us time. Finally, at one point, I was given the list of prospective companies. We were acquiring more than 30 companies a year on average, and inheriting a ton of what I was calling digital debt. And it did take a couple of acquisitions where there were just a mess of stuff we inherited that we had no idea how to manage it. The keys to the kingdom were gone. People managing those channels were no longer with the company. And so being able to identify the risks associated with that, but also the opportunities. Why did we turn off this website when there was so much organic traffic going to it? Why didn't we redirect that URL instead of letting it go, right? And so the opportunities and the risks being identified in a business case. And we actually, I still use it today with our firm now, we created a digital due diligence checklist of everything that you should be asking, just as you would with financial due diligence. There is a digital due diligence that needs to happen to identify the digital assets and the digital risks that you're about to inherit. And then we had big rules that got incorporated into the integration, the merger side, but also the integration side, because otherwise it was taking forever to try to integrate these things and what gets shut down, what gets kept, what gets migrated. But that took a really long time. There's another question about ad account management and governance. Where should that sit, and what should how should it be related to general social media governance? And so, Noah, I'd love to actually hear from you, since you kind of manage all this stuff, but also all of your perspectives on, you know, do you give agencies the keys to the kingdom and let agencies manage your paid, now that so much of social media marketing depends?
Let me get my soapbox back out. Okay.
I have two, but go ahead.
So, you know, what we've done with agencies is we give them access to our social media management platform, to Sprinkler. And so if people want to use agencies, they can, but they have to go through our platform so that we get visibility into what they're doing and can ultimately see the results of what they're doing. That also enables us to funnel things through a smaller number of ad accounts. And, you know, it's interesting. One of the things, there were, you know, a lot of drivers for why we moved to Sprinkler. As you can imagine, you know, in any sort of new tool situation, especially one where people feel that their control is being taken away, that people push back on it. And so the single greatest driver we had in our side for introducing Sprinkler was from our IT organization, our security organization, and our legal organization, because they saw risks primarily in ad accounts and in the proliferation of ad accounts in terms of causing risk to the company. And so it was the ability to centralize around a single ad account or a smaller number of ad accounts, and the significant reduction of risk that brought is what truly gave us the power to sort of push through an enterprise-wide social media management platform. And so I think, you know, in terms of ad accounts, governance of ad accounts should be closely connected to sort of overall governance. If you have an advertising team or a paid social team, you know, that in my universe is where, you know, that sort of governance of that ad account should be. What we've done at Siemens is we actually have an internal organization who sort of functions as an internal agency for media buying. They manage the ad accounts, and they also manage the relationship and the invoicing to Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter. And so they charge a commission for that, but it's a lot less than we would have spent if we went through an agency. And as anyone who's managed an ad account knows, the invoicing, you know, can be a full-time job depending on how much you're spending. And so, you know, my plug is, you know, if you're going to be spending in any significant way, consolidate your ad accounts and have the resources to have an internal person to manage that process. That's the most effective way we've found to do governance for paid.
Yep. Everything you just said. Ad accounts should definitely be managed in-house and owned by your company. This is like one of the huge things I see people do incorrectly all the time when it comes to governance. Your agency should not own your ad account. There's a couple of reasons why. Number one, if they own it, they take it with them. If you fire that agency, you lose all your historic data. It's gone. Number two, we have had instances where agencies didn't want to give us our stuff back, right? Like you should always own your stuff, like bottom line, period. Finally, for especially larger companies with big spend, if you do not have a Facebook rep or a LinkedIn rep right now because they assign reps only to companies that spend a certain amount of money, one of the problems with having all your ad accounts spread out everywhere and owned by different people is you don't have them centralized, and Facebook or LinkedIn can't see that you spend this huge amount of money every year. And so you may not have a rep because you just have this decentralized system. If you centralize it all and can prove to Facebook that you really are spending a boatload of money, they will assign you a rep. And that can be hugely valuable in terms of getting your stuff done, getting answers to questions. It also gives you access to VIP support on Facebook, which is like live chat with support, which is super helpful. There's a lot of benefits to centralizing your ad accounts besides just control. I would also say very seriously that the invoicing is a huge nightmare. So this is a case where you need to talk with people internally about the best way to do this. At least for us, we encountered that like each individual business unit had 18 different cost centers in the billing world of Cargill. And, part of the issue was, if we have one centralized account, how do you dole out the billing to the different groups, right? You got to kind of solve that problem. So you either end up with a whole bunch of ad accounts that get billed to different places, or you end up with a couple of centralized one and you do the work on the back end. But you have to figure out how that works and who does the work. And again, if you don't own it, you can't do it at all.
Yeah, I'll not only just applaud that, but add a couple more. Having a dedicated rep is extremely helpful when your channel gets hacked.
Yep.
One person to go to say, shut it down now, right? And we had the situation with a cluster that we fixed afterwards. And also, in the case of Google AdWords, what we discovered is we had so many people buying words and bidding, and now this is same with social, that we were bidding against ourselves.
Yep.
Paying up to $5 more than we should for a keyword. So this actually helped with the expansion of this discovery and business case, helped with the expansion of social media governance into other kinds of digital governance, and a true consolidation of our accounts, a lot more governance. And it also informed a taxonomy project, which was the way that we started to organize content on initially our corporate website. We did a lot of keyword arbitration, and it informed our paid and our organic digital and social media strategy. So there's just, everything has a tentacle, right? Nothing should be as siloed as it is. But unfortunately, sometimes it is.
I have one thing.
Yeah, please.
Go ahead, Casey.
I was gonna say, to the person that asked about the horse already having left the stable. The future of social is paid, and so if you feel like you can't get control over organic, maybe just start with the ad account. Start with where the money is being spent, because that's what's really going to matter moving forward. And so that would be one strategy to try and get some control, is just start with where the money is.
Good point. Yeah. I was just going to add, if your agency is paying your Facebook bills for you, make sure you dig into that contract and you really look at the money. We discovered when we audited everything that we had agencies charging us a premium on top of whatever the invoice was, just because they were paying the bill for us. And some of those were like double-digit percentages, like huge amounts of money. So make sure if your agency is paying your Facebook bills or your LinkedIn bills, that they are doing a straight pass-through charge and not charging you an upcharge for like having their credit card on file.
The cost savings argument on paid is a great KPI and a great way to report up the chain, right? What are some of your other favorite KPIs to measure success? And also, what is reporting to leadership? What should that look like? So I think those are two aligned questions.
Casey, you want to answer? Sue and I have been talking this whole time.
Yeah, sure. I really like the kind of KPI question, because when we talk about governance, or when I think about governance, a lot of times it's just about what should the footprint look like, rather than like what's going on with these channels. Are they actually working? Are they, unless there's something bad happening. When we put together like applications for new channels or approved channels, the main KPIs I think that I use are just activity on the channel, how it compares to what our other channels are. So for a lot of the B2B businesses, you're not going to get necessarily, knock it out of the park engagement on things. So you need to benchmark against what your own channels are doing in terms of engagement, click-through rates, cost per click, all those sorts of things. Do an internal benchmarking process to figure out what makes sense for your company, and use those. That's pretty straightforward in my mind.
Yeah, I would add, there's reporting for like the things that Casey was just talking about, clicks and engagement and all those things for like, how are our channels doing type of reporting. And then I also was a big fan of doing a couple times a year, a governance report for executive leaders that kind of said, here's the breakdown of our channels by region, by business group, by whatever, by platform, here's how many applications we received, here's how many new channels we started, here's how many we declined, right? And walking them through, we had standards that were kind of like, if you have a Facebook channel, you have to post twice a week. And if you, right. So we would do reporting on how many channels were out of compliance with our own standards. And that was really helpful, to raise the visibility of governance work and that it's a thing, but also in helping make the argument that like people just can't do whatever, right? That if you fall off the bandwagon and you don't post to your Facebook page for 2 months, we have a legitimate reason to talk about taking it down. Right?
Mandatory retirement. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Amber from 3M brought that idea up to me, and I've always loved it. Like having that 30, 60, 90 day, like, all right, you haven't been active.
Amber and I are like best buds.
Yeah.
We learned a lot from 3M. It was very helpful for our governance process. One thing what we were very fortunate about at Thomson Reuters was that our CEO every year would post his letter and what his goals were for the company and what his goals were for himself, and basically what he was going to be monitored and graded on by the board. So what I would do with my team every year is look at those goals and say, what does that mean for digital and social media communications? How do we take these big business goals and align them to what we do every day? And then we had a little chart and we came up with the metrics that aligned to those things. And that eventually made it into the board packet. So I had a board slide every quarter. It was one thing. It was how does digital and social media, well, we just digital at some point, align back to those business goals, and how are we doing with those? So, it's and you have to do some education, because C-suite, if they care about social at all, they're going to care about following, they're going to care about going viral, they're going to also care about the risks. Maybe we shouldn't just say anything at all because of the risks. So there's an education, and then there's when you get a little more mature with them, the alignment piece, which I think works really well.
I think of the education piece, Jen, you brought it up. C-suite's going to ask about things like followers. A big part of, I feel that my job is trying to educate them on what is good and what is bad and what metrics should we be looking at. And the first thing I say is, let's stop paying attention to how many people are following our channels. And so I do think that that one of the roles of a good social media manager, a good social media leader, is helping people who don't work and live and breathe social media just see how fast things are changing, and that the KPIs and the metrics that were good and interesting last year or 2 years ago are not necessarily the ones that are going to be important to look at moving forward. And so, we're constantly looking at two different sets of metrics. One are, we do pull the traditional metrics just so we have them, but we've stopped sort of including things like followers in our regular reporting, but they're there. But, Sue, to your point, we look at how many users do we have in our social media management platform? How many people have we trained on publishing? How many people are using our employee engagement platform? What's the average engagement rate of a piece of content in there? Things like that. And then, Jen, to your point, my mantra all the time is, don't do social metrics for the sake of measuring social, do business metrics and show how the social connects. But number of clicks, none of that matters if you can't actually track how is it connecting to the business.
Noah, in thinking about that sort of agility and what we should be measuring, what about so if we look at these global companies and they have China, Africa, Asia, wherever, there's different channels, different ways that people engage in different channels, and just different cultures, obviously, and that seems to be in a governance setting sometimes one of the more challenging things, where it's like, okay, they're using this in a completely different way, WhatsApp over here or something else. So is approaching governance without introducing too many exceptions for things that are just different in different places in the way that teams work. Any thoughts or any stories on how you've worked with global teams in India and other places who may have a totally different approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I come back to, and there was a question about, sort of how do you do governance in a place like Clubhouse where there is no, strict moderation. And, to me, it really comes down to, sort of looking at that activity at not necessarily as a social activity, but just as what is an employee doing sort of on their own. And so I work really closely with our, legal team and others to make sure that in our code of employee conduct, that we have regulations that sort of dictate how do you behave as an employee, whether you're out in public or you're on a social media platform. And so that, if someone's going to go on to Clubhouse, whether they do it as an individual or they're in theory representing their job or the brand, that there's still, expectations for how someone's going to behave. And that sort of overall code of employee conduct supersedes any specific social regulations. And I look at, similarly, we, whether it's Line or whether it's BK in Russia, there's lots of other social platforms where we don't have strict social media governance in place, but employee code of conduct sort of, as the first line of defense there against things. I think the other thing that I've really tried to do is encourage experimentation. And so if someone comes to me and says, hey, we want to try this new thing on this new social network, great, I'll partner with you to do that. If it's new and unexplored territory, I want people to try it out and feel comfortable doing that in partnership with us. And so, that's why, we were doing stuff on WhatsApp, long before it ever became popular. And, we did a lot of stuff on Reddit before they made it harder to work with brands. And so I do think that you really got to strike a balance between being the police and being governance, but also being open enough to try new things and, operate in an area that may be uncomfortable initially.
Yeah, I think I would add two things. One is you gotta remember, assuming you're here in North America, that you have a North America point of view. And so a lot of it comes to, education of yourself and listening. Like when our oil team in India, they have several B2C brands, and I really did not understand what they were doing on Facebook. And I asked them to explain it to me. We, as the global head of social media, I spent a lot of time at like 10 o'clock at night on the phone with Asia, but it was very beneficial for them to explain their strategy, explain their demographics, explain why they were taking the tactics that they did. And then their strategy made complete sense to me and I could get on board with it. So number one is don't judge, right? Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean that it's not right for that market. You need to understand it. And then two is, I think Noah was getting at the exact right answer, which is you have to build a framework with the right types of guidelines, but you can't possibly create like a social media policy that accounts for every single platform and every single thing. Like it's just impossible because it changes so fast. We did eventually build in a special section of rules in our social media policy for China because it's just so different in China, but we still held everyone across the globe to that baseline. If you want to start a new channel, you have to apply through our team. And if, there are different platforms where you have different levels of visibility in terms of administrative rights and actually governing. But you have to figure out where the line is between what is reasonable and what is just crazy, right?
And I think celebrating the wins too, right? And that encourages people to come to the team and work with you. And so, those internal case studies or internal webinars to say, here's what we tried on Clubhouse, which, by the way, I think should just become a drinking game. For the amount of times I've heard Clubhouse mentioned in every forum this week, just like whatever. And it's an interesting platform. It's a really interesting platform, and the power of audio is incredibly interesting to me. But we through our digital community of practice meetings, we would have folks talking about what they did, what really worked, and especially new things, and that celebration of them and having peers talk about what works and what doesn't is a lot more effective sometimes than having like what was perceived to sometimes the social media police saying what you should and shouldn't kind of can't do. Casey, we have a question about LinkedIn, and it really was about risks of protecting your brand on LinkedIn. But I think, one thing we haven't talked about at all really is executive activation and the opportunities of LinkedIn and the importance of LinkedIn for B2B. So if you want to kick things off around all things LinkedIn for a few minutes.
Yeah, certainly. I love to talk about LinkedIn. Coming off Clubhouse to LinkedIn, that's my speed. I've been enjoying Clubhouse. I think one of the things when you think about risks on LinkedIn or on any channel, it can be different when you're looking at executive activation on LinkedIn, because I think that there's sometimes a bigger risk of them not doing anything, right? I mean, that the safe kind of comms team point of view of like, nope, we're just not going to do anything. We're not going to say anything. We're not going to put a picture of anybody up. When we're now in this much more connected and digital world, especially over the last year or so, having no executive presence on LinkedIn, I think, is another. I mean, not necessarily a risk, but a missed opportunity. If you're in there and you're not able to find the people who run the company, if you're in advanced technology or any other really large company, that's something you should be able to do. But you get into a weird area a little bit with executives and sometimes with employee advocacy and certainly with social selling of when is this our account and we're going to treat it like a branded account because this person is the CFO or the CEO, whatever it might be, versus if they're a salesperson and they're using, branded content, they're using LinkedIn Elevate, they're using all these things, but it's certainly still their account. So it gets into this slightly odd tension sometimes with governance where we've started to ask them to do more and more, particularly on LinkedIn, as brand ambassadors or social sellers or a spokesperson. At the same time, those aren't the company's channels for the most part, right? Those are channels where they can do whatever they want with on the other hand. So I mean, I've always kind of had this idea that we need to trust, or we need to train, and then we need to trust, and then a little bit of verify and monitor, right? But for the most part, with executives, these are people that you trust to make huge business decisions. You should be able to trust them to be smart on LinkedIn, but obviously that's not always the case. And I would love to hear from any other points of view. I can talk about LinkedIn all day.
I mean, I think as far as executives go, you really have to take the temperature. I mean, the one thing I think I learned was, you can train your butt off and you can, teach your executive all the great things about LinkedIn. But the truth is, some executives are just not into LinkedIn. Like they just don't want to do it. They don't have time. They don't see the value. And so with those executives, I think having just a baseline, well, you have to have a professional looking profile that's up to date, right? Like, because if someone's looking for the CEO of this company who's applying for a job, we want them to find something that looks legitimate and professional, right? That's the baseline to me for the C-suite entirely, right? Everyone at least has to have an up to date, good looking profile. And if that's all they want, I'm not going to force them to do it because it's just a losing battle. I also think that it does cause some security questions, right? And they're questions that each company has to answer for themselves. Do you put those executive accounts into your management tool, which means everything that happens on them is documented? Like there's some companies for which that would be a good thing, and there's some executives for which that would be a bad thing, right? So those are conversations that have to happen too.
Yeah, and LinkedIn is becoming an increasingly important cyber risk for social engineering. 2 more questions, and then we're going to let Adria wrap things up. So question about digital rights, concerns about using music and copyrighted material, particularly on YouTube, Vimeo, other things. Does that fall under the purview of social media governance?
Sadly, yes. I mean, this is the thing, right? For companies that use a lot of user-generated content, or companies that use music or video or whatever, you have to make sure you have the rights to use whatever it is. I mean, that's bottom line. So, can you police every single post on every single channel? No. But you can sure as heck have guidelines and a policy and make sure your channel owners understand them. And that way you're covered if somebody violates the rules, right? You can say they took the training. We told them the right way to do it. It's a little bit of defense, but it does, in my mind, it does fall under social governance. I don't know if anybody else disagrees.
I agree that it falls under there, but it's something that it's really hard, I think, to find the sort of bandwidth to cover, unless, that's something that your company just does a lot of. And so you need to pay a lot more attention to.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's there. And I think having a policy is really important.
Looks like we lost Noah, but I was going to ask you the last most fun question of all, 1 minute each. Worst social media horror story?
Oh, goodness. Like ever?
I think mine is probably the same as yours, Jen. Having accounts taken over by the Syrian Electronic Army the night before earnings, where they were putting terrible, terrible things on the company accounts. Another one, I think this was after your time at TR, there was a company function in a different geography, and they had, as part of the show, it was supposed to be empowerment for women, and they used, from the musical Chicago, he had it coming with men with white pointed hats, hoods on for some reason. So it just brought together a lot of different problematic things, and that was widely shared by employees on social. So it wasn't like the event itself was fairly questionable, but was within maybe a different cultural box. But once it started getting shared, the hoods and the scantily clad Chicago musical things, as a message of empowerment, didn't ring true everywhere, maybe the way that it did if you were there in person. And so that was something that we had to quickly find basically everyone who was there who had posted anything about it and reach out to them individually, like by text and by whatever other means possible, and say, please, we appreciate that you, yes. Yeah. Like, it's not really your fault for sharing what you shared, because that should have never been in front of anyone's eyes.
Yeah. 30 seconds, Noah. Worst social media horror story?
Oh God, worst. Well, it'll be worse than then what turned into best. So 10 or 12 years ago, when I was at Autodesk, we had a customer, Dead Mouse, who was a famous DJ, and he started complaining on social media that his software wasn't working to design his new mouse head that he wanted for his set. And he started complaining, and his fans took up the mantle, and we started getting hundreds of negative tweets about, Autodesk, what are you doing? We had no plan in place to respond. We had no social response. As a PR guy, I, saw it, figured out how to, get our product support to support him. And then, 6 hours later, he tweeted, "Thank you, Autodesk, for helping me, solve this issue." And that actually is what got me started, down a path of working in social media. So, I think that's a good lesson that, something that may seem like a crisis may also point out where is there an opportunity. And I think that's really where governance comes into play. That's a perfect example of why you need governance. And so for people out there trying to figure out, how do I do this and how do I get into governance? Maybe you just need to find a really good crisis to show why you need it.
I love that. I love ending on that note. Our horror story also ended with a real upside. And so for those of you on the line that haven't had a social media crisis, just know that there's survival at the end, sometimes a good outcome. I hope you found this valuable. I hope I've answered asked all your questions and had our panel answer all your questions, but please feel free to reach out. And if we can help you with social media governance, please contact us. And I'm going to let Adria close us out and tell you about our next webinar. And thank you, Sue and Noah and Casey and everybody for your wonderful questions and a great conversation. Adria?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. A recording of this session will be available on biznology.com, and I will send out an email after. So look out for that. That's okay. And also please be sure to join us for our next webinar featuring Mark Dollins and Gurmeet Ahluwalia. It is on 2021 trends, predictions, and hot topics, the New Deal in a post-pandemic world, the evolution of corporate culture, and the employer-employee relationship in the new world of remote work. So be sure to join us on February 25th from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific. And I will also send out a link to register in my follow-up email. So thank you so much again to our speakers and everyone for joining, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.